He was 17 years old, and he had walked a long way. The road from Stagira to Athens was not a short one. It crossed the north of Greece and moved south through country that changed slowly, from the cooler, quieter hills of Macedonia into the denser heat and noise of the great southern city. He carried very little. He arrived, as far as anyone knows, on foot, in the way that people arrived at things in the 4th century before the Common Era, which was slowly and with the full weight of the distance behind them. Athens in 367 BCE was still a city that believed itself to be the center of something. The Peloponnesian War had ended 30 years earlier, leaving wounds that had not entirely healed, the walls that had been torn down and rebuilt, the democracy dismantled and restored, the wealth diminished and partially recovered. The city was not at its height, but it still had the academy, and the academy still had Plato. The young man from Stagira would spend the next 20 years inside those walls. He would arrive as a student and remain as a thinker of increasing consequence, working in close proximity to one of the most forceful philosophical minds the ancient world would produce. He would learn the arguments. He would follow them carefully, seriously, with the full attention of a mind that was already, even at 17, more interested in the thing in front of him than in the principle behind it. And slowly, over those 2 decades, something would shift, not in a way that made headlines, not in the manner of a dramatic public break, but quietly, the way a river changes course when the ground beneath it changes, invisibly and by degrees. His name was Aristotle. The academy stood in a grove northwest of the city, named for the hero Academos, shaded by olive trees and open to the long Athenian light. Its colonnades were marble, its pathways were shaded and well maintained. Plato had been teaching there for close to 20 years by the time Aristotle arrived, and the institution had already acquired the particular quality that serious intellectual communities sometimes develop, a feeling of existing slightly outside ordinary time, where the questions being asked were older than any of the people asking them, and the conversations were never quite finished. Aristotle entered it for the first time as someone who had come from far away. Stagira was a small city in Chalcidice, in the north, where his father Nicomachus had worked as a physician to the Macedonian court. This detail matters more than it might seem. A physician's household in the ancient world was a place of careful, methodical observation of bodies, symptoms, causes, and outcomes. The habits of attention formed in such a household were not the habits formed in a household of poets or priests or politicians. They were the habits of someone trained to look at what was actually there, to distinguish what could be seen from what was merely supposed, to resist the consolation of a beautiful explanation in favor of an accurate one. Those habits followed him into the academy. They would follow him for the rest of his life. Plato, when Aristotle arrived, was already developing the philosophical project that would come to define his legacy, the theory of forms. The world of particular things, Plato argued, was not the world of ultimate reality. The beautiful object was beautiful because it participated in the form of beauty, which existed independently, unchangingly, in a realm that transcended the visible. The just act was just because it reflected the form of justice. Knowledge, genuine knowledge, was not knowledge of the changing particulars that moved through the world of sense and shadow. It was knowledge of the forms, permanent, perfect, and accessible only to the philosophical mind, that had trained itself to look beyond appearance toward the eternal structures behind it. This was a powerful and genuinely serious argument. Aristotle took it seriously. He engaged with it for 20 years, examining it from multiple angles, following it to its limits, pushing at its foundations, with the methodical patience of someone who had been taught to look very closely at what was actually there. He was not dismissive. He was not in a hurry to disagree. He was the kind of thinker who needed to understand a position thoroughly before he could fairly say what he thought of it. And thoroughly understanding Plato's position took time. What he found over that long period was not that the theory was foolish. What he found was that it created a particular problem, one that became more difficult to overlook the more carefully he examined it. If the form of a horse exists separately from all actual horses, in some realm untouched by matter and change, then what does it mean to say that the form and the horse are connected? What is the nature of that participation Plato described? Aristotle asked this question with characteristic precision, and the answer, as he examined it, was not satisfying. The relationship between form and particular seemed to require its own explaining, and that explanation would require another. The problem did not resolve. It multiplied. There was also the question of knowledge itself. If reality resides in the forms, and the forms are accessible only by turning away from the particular things of the physical world, then the physician who carefully observes a patient, the farmer who reads the condition of the soil, the craftsman who knows what wood can and cannot do, all of these people are oriented, on this account, in the wrong direction. They are looking at shadows, and yet their knowledge is real. Their attentiveness produces genuine results. Whatever they know through the careful examination of particular things, not through departure from them. Something in Aristotle resisted the departure. This was not a temperamental preference for the concrete over the abstract. He was perfectly capable of abstract argument, as everything he later wrote demonstrates. It was a philosophical judgment. The particular thing in front of him was not a lesser version of something more real elsewhere. It was the place where reality was. The universal was not separate from the particular. It was in the particular, available to anyone who looked carefully and thought honestly about what they found. This conviction that the proper objects of knowledge are the particular things of the physical world, understood through careful observation and rigorous inquiry, would become the foundation on which everything else he built would stand. But none of this became clear all at once. It arrived slowly, over years of working inside and against the tradition Plato had established, in the shaded walks and the lecture rooms of the academy, in the notebooks and the conversations, in the long afternoons of argument that ended without resolution and were picked up again the next day. Aristotle was not someone who made quick decisions about difficult things. What it looked like from the inside on some ordinary afternoon in those 20 years might have been this: a stylus pausing over a wax tablet, a sentence half written, a thought that had been moving in one direction, finding itself redirected, not toward the form behind the thing, toward the thing itself. There was no rupture. There was no moment of declared opposition, no public dispute in front of the assembled students, no confrontation staged in the grove under the olive trees. Aristotle continued to work within the academy until Plato's death in 347 BCE. He continued to engage with the arguments, to teach, to develop his own thinking in conversation with his teachers. The relationship was sustained and serious and long. Whatever the disagreements that developed, they developed inside a genuine philosophical partnership that lasted 2 decades. After Plato died, Aristotle left Athens. He traveled first to Assos on the coast of Asia Minor, where a small philosophical community had formed under a former student of Plato's named Hermias. He taught there. He married Hermias's niece, a woman named Pythias. He continued working. Then came Lesbos. The island sits in the Aegean, not far from the Turkish coast, and in Aristotle's time it was a place of considerable natural richness, rocky coasts giving way to sheltered lagoons, tidal pools, marshland, an extraordinary variety of sea life. He arrived there around 345 BCE, and what he did there was characteristic of something deep in his nature. He looked. He spent time at the edge of the lagoon at Pyrrha, a shallow, warm inland sea on the island's western coast, watching. He observed the movement of fish through shallow water. He noted the structures of marine creatures, their organs, their behaviors, their relationships to their environments. He crouched at the waterline in the way of a person genuinely curious about what is there, not what ought to be there, not what a theory would predict. He was developing the foundations of what would eventually become his works on biology, works that would describe more than 500 animal species with a systematic precision that would not be matched for nearly 2,000 years. The connection between what he was doing at the edge of that lagoon and what he would later do in the Nicomachean Ethics is not merely metaphorical, it is philosophical. The same orientation, patient, particular, observational, resistant to the imposition of external frameworks on the thing being studied, runs through everything. The sea creature in the tidal pool, and the courageous soldier in the field, and the just magistrate in the city are all, for Aristotle, objects of the same kind of inquiry, careful observation of particular things, gradually revealing the structures and purposes that make those things what they are. He did not think that knowledge arrived from above. He thought it arrived from within the things themselves, visible to anyone who looked with enough care and enough time. Then, in 343 BCE, came the summons that would interrupt his island work and send him north. Philip II of Macedon, whose expansion through northern Greece had been reshaping the political landscape for years, invited Aristotle to become the tutor of his 13-year-old son. The boy's name was Alexander. What passed between Aristotle and the young Alexander during those years of instruction has been the subject of considerable speculation across the centuries, and honesty requires acknowledging that most of that speculation is exactly that. What is known is that the arrangement lasted until around 335 BCE, when Alexander began the military campaigns that would carry him across Persia and into the far reaches of what is now India and Pakistan. What Aristotle made of those campaigns, what it was like to watch the person he had taught for years become one of the most consequential military figures in the ancient world, is not recorded in any way that makes it fully legible. What is recorded is what he did next. He returned to Athens in 335 BCE. He was 50 years old. The city he returned to was not the Athens of his first arrival. The decades of Macedonian pressure had changed its political texture, diminished its sense of independent destiny, altered the tone in which its citizens spoke about their own future. The democracy functioned, but under conditions that were different from those under which it had been established. The old confidence was not entirely gone, but it was quieter than it had been, and in some districts it had been replaced by something more cautious and provisional. Aristotle arrived in this city and did something that is, when considered from a certain angle, quietly extraordinary. He started a school, not the academy. The academy already existed under Plato's nephew Speusippus, and then under Xenocrates and Aristotle. As a Macedonian national, rather than an Athenian citizen, could not own property in the city in any case. What he founded was the Lyceum, situated in a gymnasium and public park on the eastern side of Athens, near the temple of Apollo Lycaeus. The school took its name from that temple, and it took its character from its founder's habits of mind. The defining feature of the Lyceum's teaching practice was movement. The covered walkways of the gymnasium, the peripatos, from which the school's members would come to be called the peripatetics, became the setting for philosophical instruction conducted in motion. The arguments were not delivered from a fixed position to a seated audience. They were worked through in motion along the length of those shaded pathways, the teacher and students moving together at a pace suited to the kind of slow, careful thought that philosophy requires. This is worth pausing on. The connection between walking and thinking was not incidental for Aristotle. It was an expression of something his philosophy consistently insisted on, that thought is not separate from the body in which it occurs, that the mind does not operate from some detached location above the physical world, but is embedded within it, subject to its conditions and enriched by its engagement. The covered walkway in the Lyceum was not just a practical accommodation for a school without fixed premises. It was a small enactment of a philosophical conviction. The Lyceum's work was encyclopedic from the beginning. Aristotle and his students were investigating logic, rhetoric, biology, physics, meteorology, politics, poetry, and ethics, not as separate disciplines that happened to be housed in the same institution, but as interconnected branches of a single inquiry into the nature of things, the causes that govern them, and the purposes they serve. The world for Aristotle was not a collection of separate domains. It was a continuous whole in which every kind of thing had its place and its proper investigation. He was also at the Lyceum doing something more specific than producing research across many fields. He was building an account of what it means to live well, an account that would become the text known as the Nicomachean Ethics. The name requires a small note. The Nicomachean Ethics is named for Aristotle's son, Nicomachus, who is believed to have had some role in editing or organizing the work after his father's death. The text itself has the quality of working notes, rather than a polished treatise, dense, uneven in places, organized around lines of argument rather than literary presentation. It reads in many passages as though it was written for minds already engaged in the conversation it is contributing to, rather than for a general reader approaching the questions fresh. This quality is not a deficiency. It is a reflection of the institution in which the thinking developed. The Nicomachean Ethics is a Lyceum text in the deepest sense. It grew from the ongoing conversation of a community of thinkers working through the same problems together, returning to the same questions from different angles, leaving arguments open when they needed to remain open, and pressing them further when further pressing was possible. What Aristotle was trying to do in those pages was not simply to describe how human beings behave, though careful observation of human behavior was one of his primary methods. He was trying to say something about what human beings are for, what kind of life is genuinely suited to what human beings most fundamentally are. The ethics and the biology were parts of the same project. The creature he studied at the edge of the lagoon on Lesbos and the citizen he studied in the streets and assembly halls of Athens were both, for him, objects of the same inquiry. What is the nature of this thing, and what does it mean for that thing to function well? The question of human flourishing was not, for Aristotle, a question that could be answered by looking away from the world. It could only be answered by looking at the world more carefully, at the specific form of life that human beings actually live, with its characteristic capacities and activities and social arrangements in the specific kind of community that makes those capacities possible. Athens, in 335 BCE, was such a community. It was diminished but not destroyed. It was uncertain but not without resources. It was a city in which people still deliberated together about how to live, still argued in the assembly, in the marketplace, in the gymnasium about justice and courage and the proper distribution of civic honor. And those arguments, however complicated by the political pressures of the time, were still recognizably the arguments of people trying to work out how to live together well. Aristotle moved through this city on foot, along the paths of the Lyceum, with students whose sandaled steps were audible on stone. He had, by this point, spent more than 30 years in serious inquiry, at the academy under Plato, on the coast of Asia Minor, at the edge of a tidal lagoon on a Greek island, in the court of a Macedonian king, and now here, in middle age, in a city whose future was genuinely uncertain, beginning something new. This is what the founding of the Lyceum was, not a triumph, not the culmination of a long career reaching its expected peak. It was the deliberate choice, at 50, to begin again, to establish the conditions under which the kind of thinking he believed was necessary could continue to happen with the rigor and the patience and the community it required. There is something in this that repays quiet attention. The world Aristotle was working in had changed substantially from the one in which he had first arrived at the academy. The political order of the Greek city-states was under pressure that would only increase. The autonomy of Athens, so central to its self-understanding, was increasingly constrained. The broad sweep of Macedonian power had altered the landscape in ways that could not be reversed. And yet here was a man of 50, in full possession of his powers, choosing to sit down at the beginning of something rather than the end, choosing to ask again from the beginning what it means to live well, and to ask it in the company of others who were willing to walk slowly along a shaded path in the afternoon light and think it through together. The school he founded would operate for nearly a century after his death. The texts produced there, including the Nicomachean Ethics, the Politics, the Metaphysics, the biological works, and the works on logic and rhetoric that would form the backbone of Western intellectual education for more than a millennium, would travel through Hellenistic Alexandria, through Arabic scholarship in Baghdad and Cordoba, back into medieval Europe, and forward into the present, in ways that Aristotle, walking those paths in the late afternoon of the 4th century BCE, could not have begun to anticipate. But the founding was not done with those consequences in mind. It was done with the particular city in mind, the particular questions, the particular students, the particular afternoon light that fell across the covered walkways of the Lyceum as the arguments moved slowly from one end of the colonnade to the other. The Lyceum at dusk had a particular quality. The covered walkways were half lit, the conversations finished or trailing into comfortable silence, the students dispersed into the city. A man in middle age, moving slowly along the length of the walk, thinking the arguments of the day settled into some provisional arrangement, ready to be taken up again tomorrow. The city beyond the walls was uncertain of its future, and inside those walls the thinking continued, patient, particular, grounded in the visible world, asking what it means for the kind of creature that reasons and chooses and acts in community to live that life well. That question was not new. It had been asked before, in other forms, by other people, but the way Aristotle was asking it, from within the world rather than above it, through the patient examination of what human life actually consists in, rather than through comparison to an ideal it could never fully reach. That was a different orientation, arrived at over a long time, quietly and without drama. He was 50 years old. The city was uncertain. The school was new. The question had, in a sense, only just begun. In the Lyceum, on a morning when the light came in low and the covered walkways were still cool from the night, Aristotle put a question to his students that was not yet a theory. It was the kind of question that arrives before thinking has organized itself into positions, the kind that a person might ask themselves while lying still in the early hours, before the day makes its demands. He asked what it was that all human beings were actually reaching for, not in any particular act, not in any single pursuit, but underneath everything, beneath the acquiring and the building and the striving and the resting, what was the whole shape of it, pointing toward. The room was quiet for a moment. Questions of that kind tend to create a particular silence, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of recognition, the feeling that the question has always been somewhere nearby, that it has simply never been stated plainly before. Aristotle was not waiting for an answer in the ordinary sense, for he had been thinking about this for years, working through it in the way he worked through everything, carefully, with attention to the texture of actual human lives, rather than to the clean geometry of ideal forms. What he was doing, by asking the question aloud, was laying the first stone of a long argument. The argument would take him through the nature of goodness, the structure of human activity, the difference between living and living well. It would eventually compose one of the most sustained and careful accounts of the ethical life that has ever been committed to writing. But it began simply. It began with a man in a room asking what human beings are actually reaching for. The opening claim of that argument was plain enough to seem almost obvious, until it was held for a moment and examined. Every art, Aristotle said, every inquiry, every action, every pursuit aims at some good. The craftsman shaping wood aims at something. The finished object, useful and proportioned. The physician treating a patient aims at something, health, restored or maintained. The merchant in the market aims at profit. The soldier in the field aims at victory. Each of these aims is a good of some kind. Each one is something that the person engaged in the pursuit genuinely wants, something they are reaching toward. And in reaching toward it, they reach toward what they take to be good. This was not controversial, but what Aristotle wanted to press on was the structure hidden inside it, because most of these goods are wanted not entirely for themselves, but for the sake of something further. Profit is useful because it allows the merchant to live and to provide for those who depend on him and to pursue other things he values. Health is worth having, partly because without it, other things become difficult or impossible. Victory in the field allows the city to remain free, and the city's freedom allows its citizens to live and pursue whatever they take to be worth pursuing. Each good opens onto another. Each aim points past itself toward a further aim. The question was whether this opened onto an infinite regress, or whether somewhere in the structure there was a thing that was not wanted for the sake of something beyond it, a thing desired entirely in itself, the final resting place of all wanting, the good to which every other good was a pathway or a preparation. Aristotle was certain there was such a thing, not as a philosophical convenience, but because the alternative, that wanting has no final object, that every aim points endlessly past itself without arriving anywhere, seemed to him to hollow out the meaning of wanting entirely. If nothing is ultimately worth pursuing, then nothing is even derivatively worth pursuing. The structure collapses from the top down. What that final good was, almost everyone could agree on, at least in name. The Greek word was eudaimonia. It is a word that has been translated many ways: happiness, flourishing, well-being, the good life. And none of the translations quite fit, because the English words carry assumptions that the Greek does not. Happiness, in particular, suggests a feeling, a warm and pleasant interior state, a glow of subjective contentment, something that waxes and wanes with circumstance. Eudaimonia, for Aristotle, was not that. It was not primarily a feeling at all. It was a way of living, a way of acting, a kind of ongoing excellent engagement with the world, a thing that could be attributed to a life as a whole, and not merely to a moment within it. He was careful about this distinction. The difference between eudaimonia as a state and eudaimonia as an activity was not a philosophical technicality. It was the heart of what he was arguing. A person can possess the capacity for great things while lying still, while sleeping, while doing nothing at all. The capacity is real, but the life in which it finds expression is a different matter entirely. What Aristotle wanted to draw attention to was the difference between being capable of living well and actually living well, between possessing what is needed for the excellent life and exercising it in action over time through the continuous engagement of a person with the world around them. He had an image for this. At the ancient Olympic Games, the crown of olive branches was not given to the most beautiful competitor, nor to the one with the most natural strength, nor to any of the people standing at the edge of the stadium who could have competed but chose not to. The crown went to those who actually entered the arena and actually ran the race and actually prevailed. Not capability, not potential, not admirable qualities maintained in readiness without expression. The crown went to activity, to the exercise of excellence in the actual field of contest. Eudaimonia worked the same way. The excellent life was not something possessed or secured and then set down. It was something performed continuously through the exercise of what a human being distinctively was. That question, what a human being distinctively was, brought Aristotle to an argument that he built with the patience and precision of someone who knew the ground would need to hold a great deal of weight. Plants live, animals live. Both of them grow, take in nutrition, reproduce, respond to their environment. Human beings do all of these things too. But none of those shared capacities could be the key to what made human life distinctively excellent, because excellence for Aristotle was always excellence at a particular kind of thing, and what made a thing excellent depended on what the thing distinctively was, what it was for, what function it served that nothing else served in the same way. A flute player is excellent at playing the flute. A sculptor is excellent at shaping stone. A physician is excellent at restoring health. In each case, the excellence is relative to the characteristic activity of the role. And for human beings, considered as a kind of being in the world, there was a characteristic activity that distinguished them from everything else. The activity of reasoning, of engaging with the world through the capacity for thought and deliberate choice that no plant possessed, and no animal, as far as Aristotle could observe, exercised in anything like the same way. This was not an argument that feeling was unimportant, or that the bodily life was secondary, or that reason stood apart from and above the rest of human experience. It was a narrower and more precise claim that the specific excellence of a human being consisted in performing the distinctively human activity, reasoning, deliberating, engaging with the world through the faculties of mind and character, and performing it well, not merely engaging in it, performing it with excellence, exercising those capacities in their highest and most fully developed form. And because eudaimonia was not a state, but an activity, it could not be achieved at a moment and then rested in permanently. A person who had once acted courageously and then spent the rest of their life in cowardice was not a person whose life was characterized by courage. A person who had once been generous and then turned towards self-serving accumulation for decades was not, at the end of that life, a generous person. What mattered was the activity sustained over the whole of a life, the ongoing engagement, the continuous exercise, the long and patient practice of living according to reason and virtue, not merely when it was easy or convenient, but through all the ordinary and difficult passages of an actual life. There was a word for it, a specific pleasure that accompanied the excellent exercise of one's characteristic activities, and Aristotle was careful not to dismiss it. The pleasure that comes from doing something well, from exercising a developed capacity at full strength and finding that it meets the demands the world places on it, was a real pleasure and an important one, but it was a byproduct, not the aim. The archer who knocks the arrow and releases and watches it find the center of the mark feels something at that moment, a pleasure that belongs specifically to that activity and could not be extracted from it and had separately. If the archer was aiming at the pleasure rather than at the mark, the arrow would not fly true and the pleasure would not arrive. This was why Aristotle returned to the example of a king whose name had become a symbol of a certain kind of life, a legendary ruler devoted entirely to sensual indulgence, who had spent his reign in luxurious excess, who had organized his entire existence around the pursuit of pleasure as its own end. The story, circulating in Aristotle's time, carried with it a quality of pathos. Here was a man who had access to every comfort the ancient world could offer, and whose life, understood as a whole, seemed to amount to something less than a full human existence. Not because pleasure was bad. Aristotle did not think pleasure was bad. Pleasure, when it accompanied excellent activity, was a genuine good, the natural expression of a well-ordered life. But when pleasure was pursued directly as the organizing principle of a life, something went wrong. The life organized around the avoidance of discomfort and the maximization of gratification resembled, in Aristotle's framing, less the life of a thoughtful adult than the life of a well-fed animal, or more gently, the life of a person who had never quite grown into what they were capable of. There was something important in that framing that was not a judgment against comfort, but a question about completion. A life organized around pleasant sensation could be very pleasant, but it could not on its own be eudaimonia, not in Aristotle's sense, because it was not exercising the characteristic human capacity that made a life excellent rather than merely enjoyable. It was not what a distinctively human being performing their characteristic activities at full strength could look like when doing so well. The question of what counted as doing so well led Aristotle toward the virtues, the stable dispositions of character that allowed a person to act and feel in the right ways, at the right times, toward the right objects, in the right amounts. The virtues were not rules to be followed or commands to be obeyed. They were states of character, deeply formed habits of response that a person who had cultivated them would exercise naturally and with genuine pleasure, the way a trained musician plays not through effort, but through the long-settled readiness of well-practiced skill. The virtuous life was the flourishing life, not because virtue was rewarded with something beyond itself, but because the exercise of virtue was precisely what eudaimonia consisted in. But this raised a question that Aristotle neither dismissed nor resolved too quickly. Could such a life be threatened from outside? Could circumstances undermine it? The honest answer, which he was careful to acknowledge, was that a life of genuine flourishing required something more than inner virtue alone. A person stripped of friends, of the company of others who shared their values, of the basic material conditions that allowed them to act in the world. Such a person faced genuine obstacles to eudaimonia that no amount of inner excellence could simply dissolve. The person who had lost everything, who had suffered great losses, who had been reduced to circumstances of genuine deprivation. They were not simply failing to be virtuous enough. The good life required a context in which it could be lived. This was not a concession that external goods were the most important things. Aristotle was clear that virtue was primary, and that external goods mattered insofar as they enabled the exercise of virtue rather than in themselves. The wealthy person who used their wealth to act generously and to participate fully in the civic life of their community was living the excellent life in a way the wealthy person who hoarded their resources simply was not. The external good was in service to the activity. The activity was the point. There was a Solonian quality to all of this, a phrase Aristotle borrowed from the old Athenian lawgiver and poet Solon, who had said something quietly important: do not call any person happy until their life is over. The observation was not gloomy, it was precise. Eudaimonia, understood as Aristotle understood it, as an ongoing activity sustained across a complete life, could not be assigned to a person midway through that life with any finality. The life still had shape to take. Things could still happen that would change the whole picture. The full weaving could only be seen once the weaving was done. This was not the same as saying that life before its end had no value, or that flourishing in the present was provisional and uncertain. It was a more subtle claim that the shape of a life, like the shape of a long sentence, could only be fully understood in retrospect, once all the words had been arranged and the sentence had come to its close. A person in the middle of a life well lived was already living eudaimonically, was already exercising their characteristic capacities with excellence, was already experiencing the pleasures that accompanied that exercise, was already engaged in the ongoing activity that constituted the good life. But the full picture, the overall shape that could be looked at whole, required the completion that only time and eventually death would bring. In the Lyceum, those words would have settled over the room with a particular quality, not as a reminder of mortality, but as a kind of patience. The argument was saying, there is no shortcut to this. There is no moment at which you arrive and are finished. There is no achievement that, once secured, allows the life to proceed on its own without further care. The good life is always being made. It is always unfinished. And its unfinishedness is not a problem, but the very form it takes, the form of a life actively and continuously being lived, rather than passively possessed. On the marble walkway outside, the day's heat was beginning to build. Students moved slowly past the colonnades, continuing conversations that had started in the room and would continue through the midday hours and into the afternoon. The question Aristotle had asked at the beginning of the session, what human beings were actually reaching for, had not been answered in the way a question about a particular fact is answered. It had been opened. The answer was not a thing, but a direction, not a destination, but a quality of movement, not an end point, but an ongoing act. There was a kind of rest in that, oddly enough. The recognition that eudaimonia was not somewhere ahead, waiting to be arrived at, but present in the excellent engagement with whatever stood immediately before the person who was trying to live well. This recognition removed a certain quality of urgency from the question. It did not need to be solved all at once. It was being answered continuously through the living of it. A student who had walked in that morning carrying a vague worry about whether their life was going well enough could walk out into the afternoon with the worry not resolved but reorganized. The question was not whether they had arrived. The question was whether they were exercising their capacities well, with attention, in the circumstances they actually inhabited. If they were doing that, they were already living the life that was worth living. not as a finished thing, but as an ongoing and genuine act of human excellence. The olive trees outside the Lyceum stood in the morning air, their leaves moving slightly in a breeze that carried with it the sound of the city, further out, the ordinary sound of a place continuing its ordinary business. Aristotle would return to these questions for years. He would refine the argument, push it further, develop its implications for the virtues, for justice, for friendship, for the political life of the community. But the foundation would remain where he had placed it that morning, in the claim that what human beings were reaching for, at the end of all their reaching, was eudaimonia, a complete and active exercise of the soul's best capacities across the whole course of a life, not a feeling to be felt and then lost, not a possession to be acquired and then kept, an activity, a continuous, engaged, living act. The question had been put into the room, and the room had held it, and the students had carried it out into the afternoon with them. It would accompany them through the rest of that day and the days after, not as an urgent problem demanding immediate solution, but as an orientation, a direction in which to face when deciding how to spend the available hours. The warmth of mid-morning gathered slowly in the covered walkways. The arguments spoken there would travel outward in ways that no one present could have traced, copied into manuscripts, carried across distances, read by minds working in traditions and languages that had not yet been imagined. But they had begun here in a specific place, with a specific question asked aloud to a room of students who had come, at that hour, to think together about what a human life, lived with full attention, could become. The answer, as Aristotle had framed it, was not modest. It asked for excellence, not the excellence of heroic achievement or extraordinary natural gifts, but the quieter, more demanding excellence of a person who had cultivated their character with care, who had learned to act and feel in ways appropriate to their situations, who had practiced the virtues steadily enough that they became second nature. A person like that was not perfect. They still experienced difficulty, still encountered circumstances that tested them, still sometimes fell short of what the moment required. But across the whole of their life, in the overall shape of the thing, they were doing what a human being distinctively was, and doing it well. At the ancient games, the athlete who entered the arena and ran and fell and rose again and ran and prevailed, they received the crown. The person of equivalent natural talent, who had watched from the edge, who had possessed all the capacity and exercised none of it, who had arrived at the end of their life with their potential entirely intact and entirely unexpressed, they received nothing, not because they had failed to achieve some external standard, but because the crown was for the ones who had actually acted, actually engaged, actually been in motion. The crown was for the living of the life, not the having of the capacity. The olive crown, placed on the head of the one who had competed, was not a trophy for something finished. It was the acknowledgement of something continuously undertaken, the recognition of a life that had actually been in motion, that had actually pressed against the resistance the world offered, that had met that resistance with everything a person of cultivated character could bring. And when the games were over and the crowd had dispersed, and the day had settled into evening, the ones who had competed carried with them something the onlookers did not. Not just the memory of having won, but the lasting quality of having been fully present in the act of it, fully human, fully in motion, living, not merely waiting to live. The covered walkway of the Lyceum was quiet now, the lesson over, the voices gone, the stone held the warmth of the day. The argument had been made and set down, the first stone of a long structure placed carefully in its foundation, not with drama, not with announcement, but with the steady quiet of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time, and had simply begun on that particular morning to say it plainly. What we are reaching for is eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is not given to us. It is not inherited or discovered already complete. It is made, slowly, through the long patient exercise of what we most distinctively are. It is the activity itself, always ongoing, never finally done, always asking to be done again tomorrow, and the day after that, and through all the ordinary and difficult days that compose a life that is genuinely and actively and continually being lived. A potter sits at his wheel in the early morning. The clay is centered. His hands are wet. What he is reaching for in the movement of his palms against the turning form is not the largest vessel the clay could become, and not the smallest. He is reaching for the one that is right. Right for the purpose it will serve. Right for the hands that will hold it. Right in the proportion of its walls to its base, in the curve of its lip, in the depth of its interior. There is no formula for this. There is only the accumulated knowledge of a body that has made hundreds of vessels and learned slowly the difference between too much and just enough. When he lifts his hands and the wheel slows and the form holds its shape in the cooling air, the rightness of it is not an argument he has won. It is something he has found. Aristotle reached for that moment, a craftsman setting down a finished thing, when he tried to explain what virtue is, not because he thought ethics was a technical skill, exactly, but because he believed that moral action, at its finest, shares something with the work of someone who knows their craft deeply enough to stop calculating and simply see. The word he used when he laid out his account of how a good person acts was a word that meant hitting the mark, not splitting the difference, not settling for the average, hitting the mark the way an arrow hits its target, not by flying through the center of an abstract space, but by arriving precisely where it needed to go. That account, the formal doctrine that would come to be called the Golden Mean, is set out in the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics. It is not a simple idea dressed in complicated language. The simplicity is the complication. Aristotle is saying that moral virtue is a disposition, a stable, reliable way of being oriented toward the world that finds a kind of middle position between two corresponding failures, too much of something or too little, the failure of excess and the failure of deficiency, and between those two failures, the mean, not the halfway point, not the compromise, but the exact response that the situation actually calls for. He knew that formulation needed guarding. He knew that a reader, moving quickly, could take the doctrine of the mean for a counsel of half measures, a philosophical endorsement of never going too far, of always staying safely in the middle of things, of treating moderation as a virtue in itself, regardless of what is being moderated. That reading would be wrong. And Aristotle did something unusual. He stopped to demonstrate, with a concrete example, exactly why it would be wrong. Milo of Croton was the most famous wrestler in the ancient world. He had won at Olympia 6 times. His strength was legendary, and the stories told about him that he could carry a full-grown ox, that he had held a pomegranate in his fist without crushing it, that he trained by lifting a calf daily from its birth until it was a bull, had accumulated into a portrait of a body so far beyond ordinary human scale that he had become almost mythological during his own lifetime. When a trainer prescribed food for Milo of Croton, the prescription was not the prescription for a beginner. 10 pounds of meat, 10 pounds of bread, 10 pints of wine. This was what some ancient sources claimed he consumed in a single day. Whether or not those numbers are accurate matters less than what Aristotle takes from them. The mean, he says, is not what is intermediate between Milo's diet and the diet of the smallest beginning athlete. The mean is what is intermediate relative to each person. What Milo needs is not what you need. What you need is not what someone just beginning their training needs. The right amount is not a single fixed point floating in the abstract. The right amount is always the right amount for this person, in this condition, in this situation, for this end. That distinction between the arithmetical midpoint and the mean relative to us is the conceptual center of the whole doctrine. Everything else in Aristotle's account of virtue hangs on it. If the mean were simply the arithmetical middle, then ethics would be a calculation. Feed in the parameters, receive the correct quantity of courage. But Aristotle is insisting on something harder and more honest than that. He is insisting that the right response to a situation is not derivable from a formula, because situations do not come with the relevant variables already labeled and measured. A person arriving at a moment of moral choice arrives there as a particular person with a particular history, facing a particular configuration of pressures and possibilities. The right response is the one that fits that configuration, and finding it requires something that no formula can supply. He laid out the virtues one by one, not as a list to memorize, but as a map of the emotional and social landscape of a human life. Each virtue occupies the mean in its own domain of human action or feeling. Each domain has two corresponding failures, one on either side. The map is careful. It is also unexpectedly large, because Aristotle recognized that almost every significant domain of human experience has its characteristic way of going wrong in both directions. Take the domain of wealth and what a person does with it. The person who gives too much, who throws their resources away without judgment, who spends because spending feels good without attending to whether the giving serves any genuine purpose. This is the prodigal. The person who holds too tightly, who accumulates without generosity, who treats every expenditure as a wound. This is the miser. Between them is the generous person, not the person who gives the average amount, not the person who has found a safe middle ground between prodigality and miserliness. The generous person is the one who gives what is appropriate to the appropriate people in the appropriate amounts at the appropriate times. That kind of giving is not a quantity. It is a quality of attention to what a situation genuinely calls for. Take the domain of how a person presents themselves in conversation, how they represent their own capacities and accomplishments and qualities to the people around them. The person who claims more for themselves than they actually possess. The boaster, the one who inflates, who positions themselves as greater than they are. This is one failure. The person who diminishes themselves, who dismisses their real capacities, who performs modesty at the expense of honesty. This is the opposite failure, and Aristotle treats it as a failure, not a virtue. Between them is the truthful person, not the person who calculates the average of their inflations and diminishments, the person who simply says, honestly, what they are. That honesty requires knowing what one actually is, which is itself a form of moral achievement that neither the boaster nor the self-deprecator has managed. Take the domain of anger. This one Aristotle handles with particular care, because he knows it is the domain where the doctrine of the mean is most likely to be misread as a defense of emotional flatness. The spiritless person, he says, the one who fails to feel anger in response to genuine wrongs, who lets injustice pass without response, who smiles blandly at affronts because they have been told that anger is bad. This person is not virtuous. They are deficient. They have failed to respond to what is actually happening in front of them. On the other side is the irascible person who erupts at everything, who cannot calibrate their response to the scale of the provocation, whose anger is untethered from judgment. Between these two failures is a disposition that Aristotle notably could not quite name, a disposition to feel anger when anger is warranted in the degree that is warranted toward the appropriate person for the appropriate duration in the appropriate way. It is a disposition that is, in his own language, angry at the right things, at the right people, to the right degree, at the right time, in the right way. He lists those conditions not to make the demand seem impossible, but to show what real emotional virtue actually involves, not the absence of feeling, but feeling that is accurate. Accurate is the right word. What Aristotle is describing across all these domains is a kind of accuracy, not the precision of a calculation, but the precision of a perception. A person who has developed the relevant virtues does not arrive at the right response by running through a checklist of conditions. They arrive there because they have cultivated a sensitivity to what is actually present in a situation. They feel what is worth feeling. They act in proportion to what is actually at stake. Their interior response is calibrated to the real shape of the thing in front of them, rather than to some internal state they are managing or some rule they are following. That word calibrated points towards something Aristotle was certain of, that the virtues are not independent of each other. A person who is genuinely courageous is not only brave, they are also the kind of person who has learned to feel fear accurately, which requires a certain temperance in relation to their own emotional life. A genuinely generous person has not only learned what to give, but has learned to value wealth in the right way, which requires a whole orientation toward what matters. The virtues hang together. They mutually reinforce each other. A person who has developed one of them properly has already begun to develop the others, because what underlies all of them is the same fundamental capacity, the capacity to perceive what a situation actually is, and to respond in proportion to that perception. There is a name for that capacity. Aristotle gave it phronesis, practical wisdom. It is not the same as knowing a lot. A person can know a great deal of philosophy and lack it entirely. It is not the same as technical skill, though it resembles skill in certain ways, in the way it is acquired through practice, in the way it operates through a kind of perception rather than explicit reasoning. Phronesis is the master capacity that allows a person to find the mean in a specific situation. It is what makes the doctrine of the mean workable at all, because without it, the doctrine is simply a description of where the right response would be if someone could find it, without any account of how anyone actually could. And Aristotle was honest about what phronesis requires. It requires time, it requires experience, it requires having faced enough varied situations, with enough honest attention to how those situations actually went, that a person develops something like an interior archive of what different kinds of circumstances feel like and what they call for. It cannot be taught in a lecture. It can be cultivated in an environment that consistently presents the right kinds of challenges and that surrounds a developing person with examples of people who already have it. But ultimately, it is something that accumulates in a person over years, becoming part of how they see, rather than a skill they apply when they remember to apply it. The person who has it does not, when faced with a difficult situation, stop and think, "Let me find the mean." They simply see with the clarity of long practice what the situation is, and from that seeing, the right response tends to follow. An archer draws back the string, and the target is at a distance. There is wind, There is the particular tension of the bow on this morning in this weather. There is the specific condition of the archer's arm on this day. No two shots are ever quite the same. What the skilled archer brings to each one is not a formula, but a body of experience so thoroughly absorbed that it has become a kind of sensitivity, a sensitivity to all the variables at once, held together in the moment before release, resolved not by calculation, but by the integration of everything learned. The arrow goes where it needs to go. The release is clean. The accuracy is not the accuracy of a machine that has been correctly calibrated. It is the accuracy of a living being that has learned, through long practice, to be accurate. Aristotle saw the archer's release as an image of what virtue looks like from the outside, and he saw something equally important about what it looks like from the inside. The archer who has fully mastered their craft does not merely perform the accurate release. They feel, as they release, something that is recognizably pleasure, not the pleasure of having achieved an external goal, but the pleasure that accompanies doing something well. The virtuous person, Aristotle insists, is not someone who manages to do the right thing despite their own desires. That person has achieved something, but it is not yet full virtue. Full virtue is the state in which doing the right thing is also what one wants to do, in which the interior and the exterior align, in which the action that is right is also the action that feels natural and good, not because the person has suppressed their desires, but because their desires have been shaped through long practice to desire what is genuinely worth desiring. That claim is either the most realistic or the most demanding thing in Aristotle's ethics, depending on where one is in the process. For someone who has never tried to develop a virtue deliberately, it can sound like a portrait of someone impossibly complete. For someone who has spent years practicing patience or generosity or honest self-assessment, it can sound like an accurate description of what gradually happens, not all at once, not without setbacks, but over time, as a settled disposition slowly forms, and the effort required to act virtuously diminishes and eventually becomes almost invisible. A trainer stands beside two athletes in the early afternoon. The training ground is warm. Dust rises from the packed earth where other men are working. The first athlete is enormous, wide across the shoulders, heavy with muscle built over years of serious competition. The second is young, thin, newly arrived at the gymnasium, still learning where to stand. The trainer looks at the first athlete and prescribes. He looks at the second athlete and prescribes something entirely different, not because he has two different theories of nutrition, because he has one theory. Give each person what they actually need, and what each person actually needs is visible only to someone who is looking at them carefully, who knows enough about the human body in training to see what this particular body, at this particular stage, genuinely requires. The prescription for the large athlete would damage the young one. The prescription appropriate for the young one would barely reach the large athlete's needs. The mean is not between them. It is within each of them relative to who they are. That image of the trainer, attentive, adjusting, refusing the false comfort of a universal rule, is what Aristotle wants to leave behind as a portrait of the practically wise person, not someone who has learned the rules of virtue and applies them uniformly, someone who has developed the sensitivity to see what a situation actually is, and who responds to what they see rather than to a simplified version of it that would be easier to handle. This is where the doctrine of the mean becomes most interesting and most demanding, because it is not merely saying that virtue avoids excess and deficiency in some general way. It is saying that virtue requires, in every situation, a genuine reading of what is actually present. The courageous person does not apply a predetermined quantity of bravery. They read the actual danger, the actual stakes, the actual people involved, the actual possibilities for action, and they respond to that reading. The generous person does not apply a predetermined giving ratio. They read the actual need, the actual relationship, the actual resources available, the actual consequences of different kinds of giving, and they respond to that. What guides them is not a rule, but a cultivated capacity to read the world accurately and to feel, in response to that accurate reading, what the situation genuinely calls for. The hardest case in the catalog of virtues is the domain of anger, and it is worth staying with it a moment longer. Aristotle's insistence that a spiritless failure to feel anger is a vice, not a virtue, goes against a certain kind of moral common sense that treats emotional detachment as sophistication and anger as always a failure of control. He is not defending uncontrolled anger. He is defending the full range of appropriate emotional response. A person who witnesses a genuine injustice, someone being treated with contempt they do not deserve, someone being harmed by someone with more power, someone having what is theirs taken away without recourse, and who feels nothing, who responds with blandness, who maintains their serenity, because serenity is what they have been told is virtuous. This person is not a moral model. They are morally absent. They are failing to register the reality in front of them. Their interior state is not calibrated to the actual moral weight of what is happening. The virtue between irascibility and spiritlessness does not have a well-known name, because Aristotle himself noted that it lacks one. The language has not quite caught up to the disposition it would need to describe. But the disposition is describable. It is the capacity to feel anger, when anger is the accurate response to what is happening, in the degree that the situation warrants, directed at the person or situation that actually warrants it, sustained for as long as it is genuinely useful, and then released when the moment has passed. That kind of anger is a form of moral perception. It is the emotional equivalent of seeing clearly. It says, "This is genuinely wrong, and I am registering it as such, and my feeling is proportionate to the wrongness." Between irascibility and spiritlessness, between the person who erupts without calibration and the person who has flattened their emotional landscape in the name of composure, there is a kind of responsiveness that is alive and accurate at once. This is what the golden mean looks like in its most difficult and least comfortable form, not a comfortable middle ground, a precise and sustained attentiveness to what is actually happening, expressed in feeling and action that are genuinely in proportion to it. In the afternoon light of the Lyceum, Aristotle pressed a stylus into wax and arranged a row of words: cowardice on one end, courage in the middle, recklessness on the other end. He added another row beneath it: miserliness, generosity, prodigality, another below that, vanity, magnanimity, pusillanimity. The rows accumulated. What they made, set beside each other, was not a list of virtues to aspire to and vices to avoid. It was a map of the emotional and social terrain of a human life, with the virtuous responses marked not as peaks to be climbed, but as the accurate position in a landscape that extends in two directions from each one. The map was not meant to be memorized and consulted. It was meant to be internalized, to become eventually the way one sees. His students would have sat with that map and felt perhaps a quiet recognition. They had all known people who gave too much and people who gave nothing. They had known people who exploded at everything and people who absorbed affronts without any visible response. They had known people who boasted and people who diminished themselves needlessly, and they had known perhaps a very few people who did none of these things, who seemed in the range of their responses to the world to be consistently accurate, not perfect, not untouched by difficulty or error, but reliably, steadily calibrated to what situations actually were, rather than to some internal noise that had nothing to do with what was actually happening. Those people were the portrait Aristotle was drawing, not as an impossible ideal, but as something that actually existed in the world, that had a recognizable shape, that could be described and cultivated and moved toward through deliberate practice. The doctrine of the mean was not a description of how no one actually is. It was a description of how some people actually are, arrived at through years of paying attention and practicing right action, and gradually becoming the kind of person for whom right action is not an effort, but a natural expression. The skilled physician sees a patient and reads the situation, not the situation in the abstract, not some general category of patient with some general category of complaint, but this patient, today, with this particular constellation of symptoms and history and condition. The diagnosis arrives not as the conclusion of a reasoning chain that could be reconstructed step by step, though it could be reconstructed afterward. It arrives as a perception, a trained, cultivated, experienced perception that integrates more information than any conscious deliberation could hold at once. The physician has done this long enough that the seeing and the knowing have become one thing. That is the image Aristotle reaches for when he wants to describe what practical wisdom looks like in operation, not a philosopher calculating the right response, a person of cultivated character simply perceiving what a moment requires. The calculation might have happened thousands of times, years ago, as the disposition was being formed through practice and reflection. But by the time it is fully formed, the calculation has been internalized so completely that it is no longer visible as calculation. It is simply perception, simply seeing. A person stands at a threshold. The moment is one of those moments that have a particular weight, a social situation that calls for a response, a decision that matters, a pressure from one direction or another toward an excessive or a deficient response. The irascible reaction is available. The spiritless one is available. The prodigal response, the miserly one, the boast, the false modesty, all of them are available. And in the person of developed character, most of them simply do not present themselves as options, not because they have been ruled out by a deliberate act of will, because the person's perception of the situation is accurate enough that only the appropriate responses register as real possibilities. The rest are visible, the way the wrong notes are visible on a keyboard, but they are not tempting in the way that only a real option can be tempting. The right response is what the moment simply calls for, and the person of virtue is someone who can hear that call clearly enough to follow it without a struggle. Late afternoon, the training ground again. The large athlete has finished his work and is drinking from a cup of water at the edge of the space. The young athlete is still at it, learning to fall correctly, practicing the grip, struggling with the weight of the techniques that will eventually become second nature. The trainer watches them both. What he knows standing there is not only what each of them needs today. He knows the shape of the distance between where they are and where they could be, and he knows that the distance is covered only by moving through it, not by jumping to its far end. The large athlete was once a young one. The young one will be, if the practice continues, a different person in 10 years, not a person who has been told the right things to do, but a person whose body and attention have been shaped by years of doing them until they no longer require telling. That long, patient distance from the first attempt to the settled disposition is what the doctrine of the mean is really about. It is not a recipe. Taken spalled, it is a description of a destination arrived at by the only route there is, the repeated practice of attending carefully, of trying to hit the mark, of noticing when one has missed it, and understanding why, and of returning again and again to the attempt. The virtues in Aristotle's account are not traits one either has or lacks. They are dispositions that form gradually in the space between action and reflection, between the attempt and its assessment, between the person one is at the beginning of the practice and the person one becomes at the end of it. The mean is never a fixed point. A fixed point could be memorized and reproduced. The mean is always the right response to what is actually in front of a person, which means it shifts as situations shift, as the person involved shifts, as the relationships and stakes and circumstances change. What courage looks like in a small social risk is not what it looks like on a battlefield. What generosity looks like between friends is not what it looks like between strangers. The mean tracks the situation, and tracking the situation requires a sensitivity that is always being refined, always being tested by new situations, always revealing that there is more to learn about what the world is actually like and what it genuinely requires. The archer releases the arrow again. The target is slightly different, closer today, in different wind, at a different angle. The release adjusts, not by deliberate calculation, but by the integration of everything the archer's body and attention have learned about how arrows move through air and what they require. The arrow finds its mark. The sound of it arriving is clean and final. The archer knocks another arrow and draws. The practice continues. What Aristotle was reaching for through the whole of his account of virtue and its mean was the portrait of a person who lives that way, not just in archery, not just in any single domain of skill, but in the full range of emotional and social and moral life. A person whose responses to the world have been so carefully cultivated over such a long time by such consistent attention to what is actually happening and what it actually calls for, that their seeing and their acting have become unified, not perfect, not beyond error or growth, but genuinely and reliably calibrated to what is real, responding to what is actually happening rather than to noise or habit or fear or pride. The clay on the wheel holds its shape in the cooling air. The walls are right, the depth is right, the lip has exactly the curve it needs. The potter sets it down and does not admire it. It is simply done. The rightness of it is not a judgment he makes. It is something the vessel itself carries, quietly, in the way its proportions hold together. He turns back to the wheel. There is more clay. There is more mourning. Practical wisdom, Aristotle knew, is not something a person arrives at and then possesses. It is something that continues to develop as long as a person continues to face the world with honest attention. Every new situation presents the possibility of a response that is more accurate than the last one, a slightly better reading, a slightly more calibrated feeling, a slightly cleaner alignment between what the moment is and what the person brings to it. The refinement does not end. The mean is always being found again, relative to whoever is finding it, in whatever situation is finding them. And that finding, patient, attentive, lifelong, returning always to the actual particulars of what is in front of one, is what Aristotle meant when he said that virtue is not a state, but an activity, always in motion, always in practice, never finally secured and set aside. The walkways of the Lyceum are quiet now. The students have gone. The afternoon has deepened into early evening, the light falling at a long angle across the stone. The wax tablet sits where it was left, the rows of words pressed into it still legible, the excess, the mean, the deficiency, arranged in their columns across the face of every domain of human life. Not a chart to consult before acting, a record of the shape of a cultivated perception of what a person who has learned to see clearly sees when they look at a situation and ask without calculation and without anxiety what it is and what it needs and what the most accurate response to it would be. The answer is never simple. It is never the same twice, and finding it over and over in the full variability of a human life is what the practice of virtue is. The body knows fear before the mind has named it. There is the quickening, the held breath, the particular weight that settles in the chest when something large and dangerous stands between a person and the action they must take. A soldier in Athens would have known this feeling in the long seconds before the line moved forward, not the abstract knowledge of danger, but the living fact of it, present in the muscles, in the dry mouth, in the strange clarity that comes when the ordinary world narrows to a single point. And it is precisely here, in that narrow and trembling place, that Aristotle begins his account of courage, not with a definition, not with a principle, but with the body of a person who is afraid. He does not ask the soldier to stop being afraid. That would be the wrong instruction, and Aristotle, who spent his life attending carefully to what things actually are, rather than what we might prefer them to be, understood this. The person who feels no fear in the face of genuine danger is not courageous. Aristotle is precise about this. Such a person is something else, something closer to recklessness, or perhaps a kind of insensibility, a failure of the emotional registration that ought to accompany a real encounter with what can harm us. Fear, felt in the right amount and in response to the right things, is not the enemy of courage, it is its material. Courage is what happens when a person who feels that fear acts anyway, because the reason for acting is worth more than the comfort of standing still. What Aristotle is tracing here is not a special category of heroic personality reserved for soldiers or athletes or the unusually strong. He is tracing something that runs through the ordinary texture of a lived life, the way a person carries themselves through difficulty, the way they hold their ground when holding it costs something, the quiet steadiness that belongs not to the absence of feeling, but to feeling meeting something larger than itself and not being broken by it. The courage he describes is warm because it is afraid. It is human because it trembles. And the particular pleasure that Aristotle says accompanies courageous action, the quiet satisfaction of having acted as the situation required, is a pleasure that arrives only after the trembling, not in spite of it. The soldier steps forward. The line moves. The fear does not disappear, but it is no longer in command. In Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle works through the virtue of courage with a patience that reflects how seriously he takes the difficulty of it. There are, he notes, several things that resemble courage without quite being it. The citizen soldier who fights because the law demands it, or because disgrace is worse than danger, has something admirable in their action, but something borrowed in their motivation. They are drawing on a source outside themselves, rather than acting from the stable inner disposition that genuine courage requires. The professional soldier who appears fearless because long experience has made the situation familiar is showing competence rather than virtue. Their composure is an acquired steadiness in the face of what they know, not the moral achievement of a person facing genuine uncertainty with their eyes open. These resemblances matter because they show how carefully Aristotle is looking, how reluctant he is to settle for the surface of a thing when the substance is still unexamined. Genuine courage for Aristotle is the disposition of a person who has learned, through long habituation, through many small acts of facing what is difficult, to feel fear in appropriate measure and to act for the right reasons in spite of it. The cause must be noble. The person must know, roughly, what they are doing, and the action must come from inside them, from who they have made themselves, rather than from the pressure of circumstance or the calculation of advantage. It is a demanding standard, honestly held, but it is also an intimate one, because what Aristotle is describing is not the exceptional performance of the extraordinary person. It is the grain that forms, over time, in anyone who has learned to act well under pressure, in the small and ordinary pressures of a life as much as in the large ones. The body of the courageous person carries something settled. It does not mean they are unbothered by what is genuinely bothersome. It means they have spent enough time practicing the meeting of difficult things that the meeting no longer unravels them. Temperance is a quieter virtue than courage, less dramatic in its occasions, but no less precise in what Aristotle asks of it. The Greek word he uses, sophrosine, carries resonances that the English word temperance does not quite hold, a sense of wholeness, of being sound, of the self gathered together rather than pulled apart by appetite. Aristotle defines it as the stable disposition to enjoy bodily pleasures in the right amounts, at the right times, and in the right ways, and the deceptive simplicity of that formulation hides how much is packed inside it. Consider the pleasures of eating. Food is genuine, hunger is genuine. The pleasure of satisfying hunger is not an illusion or a trap. It is a real good built into the structure of a living body, and Aristotle is not interested in denying it. What he notices is that the pleasure can be pursued in a way that organizes the whole of a person's attention around it, crowding out other goods, reducing the person to something less than they could be. The self-indulgent person he describes is not a villain. They are, in his phrase, something like a spoiled child, someone whose appetite has never been shaped by the patient work of learning to want things in proportion, who has remained at an early stage of development while the years moved on without them. The temperate person sits down at the table with hunger and attends to what is in front of them. They eat. They stop when enough has been enough. And what Aristotle wants the listener to notice is that this stopping is not the sad diminishment of an appetite that would rather have gone on. It is its own satisfaction, the clear and present pleasure of appetite, properly ordered, which is different from the pleasure of appetite simply followed wherever it leads. Sufficiency, when it is genuinely reached, has a particular quality of completeness that excess never does. Excess always wants more. Sufficiency arrives. Aristotle is careful to note that the deficiency on the other side, the person who takes no pleasure in bodily goods at all, who is insensible to what ordinary life offers, is also a failure, though a rarer one. A life with no appetite, no enjoyment of what the body can take in, is not a life of superior virtue. It is a life with something missing. The temperate person is not a person who has extinguished their desires. They are a person whose desires have found their proper shape, felt clearly, satisfied genuinely, released without grasping. The virtue, as Aristotle presents it, is not a discipline imposed from outside the person, but a freedom won from inside. The self-indulgent person is not more free because they follow every appetite wherever it leads. They are less free, the servant of whatever the body wants next, unable to rest in sufficiency because they have never learned what sufficiency feels like. The temperate person has learned this. The pleasure they take in the right amount is a pleasure they actually have, fully, rather than a pleasure that is always just beyond what they have already consumed. There is a stillness in the temperate person that is its own kind of richness. It does not look like renunciation from the outside. It looks like ease. Justice is the largest of the virtues in Aristotle's account, the one he gives most space to, the one that opens outward most explicitly into the life of the city. In Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he distinguishes between two related but different things that the word covers. The first is a kind of general justice, the complete virtue of the person who obeys just laws, treats others as they deserve, and orients their actions toward the genuine good of their community. This is not really a separate virtue from the others, but rather all the virtues considered in their outward dimension. What a courageous, temperate, generous person looks like when their character is turned toward other people rather than held in reserve. The second kind of justice is more specific. Aristotle calls it particular justice, and it governs the distribution of benefits and burdens among members of a community and the rectification of transactions that have gone unfairly. Distributive justice is not equality in the sense of identical shares. Aristotle is explicit that justice requires proportional allocation, giving more where there is genuinely more to deserve, giving less where there is genuinely less, and calibrating the distribution to the actual contributions and needs involved. This sounds potentially harsh in its logic, but Aristotle's point is the opposite of arbitrary. What he is insisting on is that genuinely fair allocation requires attention to particulars, to the actual human beings in front of the decision, rather than the mechanical application of a rule that treats every case as identical when every case is not. A magistrate distributing civic honors in an Athenian city does not reach for a formula, or rather, the formula, give to each according to what they deserve, is not a formula at all, but an instruction to look carefully, to see who has actually contributed, to weigh what has actually been given and what has actually been earned. The justice visible in such a decision is not an abstraction hovering above the scene. It is present in the careful allocation itself, in the attention brought to each particular person, the resistance to favoritism, the willingness to hold proportionality steady even when it would be easier or more comfortable to distribute equally and avoid the difficulty of genuine discernment. Rectificatory justice addresses something different. What happens when the proportionality has been violated, when something was taken that should not have been, or given under conditions that corrupt the transaction? Here, Aristotle describes a different kind of equalization, not proportional, but arithmetic, restoring a baseline disturbed by an unjust action, returning to each party what the violation had displaced. The judge who rectifies an injustice is not calculating merit or desert. They are restoring the condition that existed before the wrong was done, drawing a line under it, making it possible for the ordinary work of proportional justice to resume. What holds both kinds of justice together is attention, the careful, patient, particular attention of a person who has internalized the commitment to giving others what they genuinely deserve, neither more nor less, because treating people justly is not a constraint imposed on someone from outside, but the expression of who they have become. The just person does not feel the pull of favoritism and resist it heroically. They have become, over many years of practice, someone for whom the pull of favoritism is simply weaker than the pull of what is right. Magnanimity is a word that has traveled far from its Aristotelian home, and what it means in ordinary contemporary use, a vague sense of generous spirit, of being large-hearted toward an opponent, is not quite what Aristotle meant by megalopsychia, the crown of the virtues. His account is more particular, and in some ways more striking. The magnanimous person, for Aristotle, holds an accurately high estimation of their own genuinely great worth. This is not vanity. Vanity is the estimation of worth that exceeds what is actually there. The person who thinks themselves more excellent than they are, who claims more than they deserve, who fills a space larger than they have earned. Nor is it false modesty, the underselling of real excellence, the deliberate shrinking from the responsibilities and honors that genuine achievement entitles a person to claim. Aristotle calls this pusillanimity, the deficiency, and he regards it as a real failure of virtue. When a person of genuine excellence refuses to hold themselves to the standard their excellence sets, they fail both themselves and the community that might have benefited from their full engagement. The magnanimous person stands in the middle of these two failures, and what it looks like is a portrait that has always been easier to misread than to inhabit. They move unhurriedly. They are unimpressed by petty slights, because petty slights have nothing to do with what they actually care about and know themselves to be. They speak plainly about what they can and cannot do, without inflation and without deflation, the plain register of self-knowledge, neither proud nor apologetic. They bear good fortune without boasting, because boasting would imply that the good fortune was a surprise, that it exceeded what they had reason to expect, and the magnanimous person has no such expectation gap to fill. What they deserve and what they receive tend in a well-ordered life to be roughly aligned. What Aristotle describes in ill fortune is particularly striking. The magnanimous person bears adversity without collapse, without the dramatic expression of a self broken by what the world has done to it. This is not because they feel nothing. Aristotle never asks the virtuous person to be insensible to what genuinely affects them. It is because the locus of their worth is not located in what happens to them. The external setbacks, lost honor, lost wealth, the reversals of circumstance, touch the surface of a life without penetrating to its source. The excellence that constitutes a person's genuine worth is inside the character, inside the cultivated dispositions that no misfortune can simply revoke. What was built through long practice does not come apart when circumstances change. There is a dignity in this portrait that is entirely interior. It does not require the world's confirmation. It does not wait for circumstances to be favorable before it is fully itself. The magnanimous person is not indifferent to the world. They care about acting well in it, contributing to it, being recognized for what they genuinely bring to it. But their stability does not depend on the world's response. Their foundation is under their feet rather than in the hands of circumstance. Aristotle admits that this virtue is rare and difficult to exhibit without appearing arrogant from the outside. A person who holds themselves to a high standard, who does not flinch from claiming what their excellence entitles them to, who moves through the world with the unhurried steadiness of someone who knows their own ground. This can look, from the wrong angle, like pride in the pejorative sense. The difference is in the accuracy of the self-assessment. The magnanimous person is not inflated. They are not performing a confidence they do not actually feel. They have looked at themselves honestly, seen what is genuinely there, and settled into a relationship with that reality that neither diminishes it nor exaggerates it. The composure is earned, the steadiness is real, and when misfortune arrives, as it will, because Aristotle is not naive about what the world offers, the portrait does not change, because the source of the portrait was never located in what the world was currently providing. Woven through all of these virtues, holding them together and making them possible in the particular situations where they are required, is something Aristotle treats as a virtue of its own, the master capacity that the other virtues depend on. He calls it phronesis, and the nearest English word is practical wisdom, though even that translation flattens something. Phronesis is not wisdom about abstract matters. It is not theoretical knowledge of what virtue is, or of the principles that govern just action, or of the philosophical framework within which courage and temperance and justice are defined. A person can know all of that and still be at a loss when a real situation calls for a specific response in a specific moment with specific people at stake. Phronesis is the capacity to perceive what a particular situation morally requires, and to respond to it with action that is the seamless expression of an integrated character. Aristotle distinguishes it from theoretical wisdom, which concerns the necessary and unchanging features of the world, mathematics, first principles, the structures that cannot be otherwise than they are. He also distinguishes it from technical skill, which is the reliable production of a determinate result in a domain with clear standards. A physician has technical skill, an architect has technical skill, but the practitioner of phronesis is doing something different. They are engaging a domain where the standards are not given in advance, where no rule book specifies what this specific moment between these specific people with this specific history requires, where the general principles that can be stated abstractly must be translated into a particular judgment that the general principles alone cannot provide. This is why phronesis is so difficult to acquire and so easy to underestimate. The person who possesses it does not appear to be doing anything complicated. They look, they consider, they respond. The response seems obvious in retrospect, even simple, but the simplicity of the response is the product of an enormous amount of invisible work, years of practice, of attending to what situations demand, of getting it wrong and noticing the error and returning with better calibration, of gradually becoming someone whose perceptions of moral reality are reliable rather than distorted by selfishness or impatience or the laziness of applying yesterday's answer to today's question. In the Lyceum, Aristotle sat with students and worked through case after case, not to provide the answers to standard situations, but to develop the capacity to see situations clearly. The process was the point, the sharpening of perception over time, the cultivation of a sensitivity to what various circumstances genuinely call for. This is what produces the person who, standing in a moment of genuine moral complexity, simply knows what to do, not because they have memorized the rule that applies, because they have become the kind of person who sees what is actually there. There is a particular image that Aristotle offers, though not always explicitly, that runs under all of his virtue ethics and gives it its characteristic texture. It is the image of a person of cultivated character who has spent enough years practicing attentiveness that the practice has become invisible. The courageous person does not deliberate about whether to be courageous in the moment. Courage is required. The temperate person does not wrestle with appetite in full view of the table. The just person does not perform the effort of fairness, turning each allocation over laboriously before settling on the proportional answer. The magnanimous person does not rehearse their composure before meeting misfortune. All of these responses have, through long repetition, descended from the level of deliberate choice into something deeper, a set of stable dispositions that express themselves naturally, without the friction that belongs to the early stages of acquiring them. Aristotle calls this second nature, though the phrase is not his own. What he does say is that virtue is built through habit, that the repetition of virtuous actions gradually forms the character that produces virtuous actions naturally, and that the pleasure accompanying virtuous action is itself a sign of virtue achieved. The person who does the right thing and feels good doing it has reached a different stage than the person who does the right thing and wishes they had done otherwise. This is not a small distinction. The person who is still at odds with their own virtue, who is temperate in action but self indulgent in desire, who is just in behavior but resentful in feeling, occupies what Aristotle calls the condition of continence rather than virtue. Continence is real, it is better than incontinence, but it is not yet the integrated condition where what a person does and what they want have been brought into a deep alignment, where the character is all of one piece rather than a divided territory in which the better and worse parts negotiate an uneasy settlement. Virtue, as Aristotle means, it is the condition on the far side of that settlement, not the negotiation, but the resolution, not the management of competing impulses, but the integration of the whole person into someone whose wanting and doing and knowing all tend in the same direction. Getting there takes time. It takes practice. It takes, above all, the honest reckoning with the gap between where a person is and where their character is trying to go, and the willingness to return to the practice even when the returning feels effortful, which it always does at first, and less effortful as the years move on. A student who had studied in the Lyceum for many years would eventually reach a point where Aristotle's questions, what does courage require here? What does justice distribute there? What does this situation call for from a person of good character? Were no longer puzzles to be solved from outside, but prompts for a perception they had gradually developed from inside. The philosophy would have gone somewhere, not into the student's memory of propositions about virtue, but into the student's way of seeing the world, the way they moved through its situations, the range of responses available to them when situations pressed. This is what Aristotle is after, not students who know what virtue is, students who are becoming virtuous. The difference is the entire difference. Practical wisdom, phronesis, is what makes all the other virtues work together rather than generating conflicts between themselves. The person of genuine practical wisdom sees when courage is called for, and when what looks like courage is actually recklessness. They see when generosity is what a situation requires, and when what presents itself as generosity would actually harm the person on the receiving end. They see when the apparent demand for justice needs to give way to something more flexible, more attentive to the full particular humanity of the person standing in front of the decision. The virtues are not a list of separate capacities that happen to coexist in a person of good character. They are a unified way of being, held together by the capacity to see clearly, and seeing clearly is what practical wisdom provides. This is why phronesis sits at the apex of Aristotle's account of moral virtue, not as one virtue among others, but as the condition under which all the others can be exercised well. Without it, courage becomes recklessness or stubbornness, temperance becomes mere self-denial, justice becomes rigidity, magnanimity becomes a performance of confidence rather than its genuine expression. With it, each virtue finds its proper application, its proportionate expression, its responsiveness to what the actual situation requires, rather than to what some general principle dictates without knowledge of the details. The person of genuine practical wisdom, after many years of practice, simply sees not everything, not with perfect accuracy. Aristotle is not describing a faculty of moral omniscience, and the honest limit of his account is that it can describe the condition without guaranteeing its reliable attainment. But the kind of seeing that phronesis makes possible, the clear-eyed recognition of what this moment calls for, this person in this situation, with this history and these stakes, is the goal toward which the whole long project of moral development is oriented. It does not announce itself when it arrives. There is no moment at which the practically wise person becomes aware that they have crossed a threshold. What happens instead is subtler. The friction reduces, the perception sharpens, the responses become more reliably what they should be, and at some point, the whole process feels less like effort and more like seeing the same world seen more clearly, the same situations perceived with more accuracy, the same fundamental questions about how to act, answered not faster, but better, because the person answering them has been changed by the years of asking. And the portrait that all these virtues together produce, the courageous, temperate, just, magnanimous, practically wise person, is not a portrait of perfection. Aristotle is not drawing an ideal that no actual person could inhabit. He is describing the shape of a life that has been worked on, that has been brought, through long patient practice, into something like coherent, excellent functioning. The virtues are achievable. They are not achieved once and held permanently. They remain activities ongoing, requiring the continued exercise that maintains them. But they are genuinely achievable by actual human beings moving through actual human lives, and that availability is part of what makes Aristotle's ethics feel, even across the long distance of centuries, like something addressed to a real person rather than to an abstraction. The magnanimous person who bears ill fortune without collapse does not do so because they have somehow exempted themselves from the reach of misfortune. They have not secured themselves against the world's reversals. They have cultivated over a long time a relationship to their own excellence that does not require the world to cooperate in order to remain intact. The soldier who steps forward, despite fear, does not do so because the fear has gone. The fear is there, felt fully, and the stepping forward happens anyway, because of who the person has become, not in this moment alone, but in all the moments of practice that preceded it and formed the character that makes this moment possible. The courageous person's fear and their courage exist in the same body at the same moment, not in opposition, but in a kind of earned companionship. The temperate person's pleasure in sufficiency is not the lesser pleasure of diminished appetite, but the fuller pleasure of appetite ordered and genuinely satisfied. The just person's careful proportional attention to what each individual deserves is not the mechanical application of a formula, but the expression of a character that has made fairness its own. The magnanimous person's steadiness under misfortune is not the performance of composure, but its reality, an internal groundedness, so deep and so long established that what happens on the surface of a life does not reach all the way down to its source. These portraits are not finished in their original formulation. Aristotle knew that and said so in various ways, in the qualifications he builds into each virtue, in the acknowledgement that no rule can substitute for the judgment of the practically wise person, in the repeated insistence that the mean is always relative to who is acting and in what situation. The virtues he describes are living things, responsive to circumstances, sensitive to particulars, dependent on the continuing exercise of practical wisdom to remain themselves rather than hardening into rigid procedures. What he leaves behind is not a rule book. It is a direction, an orientation, an account of what excellent human activity looks like when it is fully underway, and the quiet insistence that the underway is the point, that the activity itself, carried on well over the full length of a life, is where the good of it lives. The magnanimous person carries their worth inside themselves, steadily, without requiring the world's confirmation. The character so internally grounded has no need of permission from external circumstances to remain what it is. And in that portrait, unhurried, unboasting, accurate in its self-knowledge, stable under the press of what cannot be controlled. There is something that rests on its own foundation, undisturbed, complete in the way only long practice can make a thing complete. A child stands in a marketplace in ancient Athens, beside a man whose hand rests on her shoulder. She has taken something that did not belong to her, a small thing, a piece of fruit perhaps, or a coin found on the ground that was not hers to keep. And the man beside her is guiding her back to the person she took it from. She does not fully understand why. She understands the discomfort of returning it, the resistance in her body, the wish that this moment were already over. What she does not yet understand is the thing the action is slowly building inside her, something that will not be complete for years, something that will require this moment and 100 moments like it before it becomes entirely her own. Aristotle noticed this. He noticed that the child performing a just act under instruction is not yet a just person, and that the distance between those two states, between the guided action and the character that no longer requires guidance, is the whole of moral life. He had a word for that distance. He called it authos, which his language already held the word for habit, for the grooves that repeated action cuts into a person until the action runs there naturally, the way water finds the low places in stone. From authos, he derived the word for moral virtue itself. The connection was not accidental. It was the heart of everything he believed about how human beings become what they are capable of being. The Greek word for moral virtue, ethike, carries this inside it like a seed. Character is not given. It is not a possession handed down or a capacity that arrives fully formed. It is built slowly, through practice, through the repetition of actions that at first require effort and attention and the guidance of someone who has already found their way through, and that gradually, over the long patient years, become second nature. They become easier. They become more pleasurable. They begin to feel, eventually, like the shape of who a person simply is, though they were never simply that. They were made one careful action at a time, out of the same ordinary human material that begins in confusion and is capable, given time and practice, of something steadier. This is the place where Aristotle's ethics opens into something larger than a set of principles. The principles are there, the mean, the virtues, the account of what excellent action looks like in each domain of human life. But the principles are not the destination. They are instruments of formation. They describe the shape that character is working toward, so that the person being formed and the community doing the forming can recognize the direction they are moving in. What is actually happening underneath the principles is a long and patient process of becoming. Aristotle believed that no one arrives at virtue quickly. The person who has just been told what courage is and has resolved to practice it is not yet courageous. They are at the beginning of courage. They will act with something like courage, imperfectly, and then more fluently, and then with less effort, and then one day the action will arise in them before they have decided to perform it, because they have become the kind of person whose first response to a situation that demands courage is to move toward it rather than away. That morning, the morning when the difficult action arises naturally, without the internal argument that used to accompany it, is a long way from the marketplace, and from the child who did not yet understand why returning the fruit mattered. But it begins there. What is practiced becomes stable. What is stable becomes second nature. What is second nature becomes in time indistinguishable from the self. Not because the self was always that way, but because the self has been built into that shape by everything it has done. Aristotle saw this as neither mysterious nor mechanical. It was simply what human beings are. creatures whose nature is to be completed by culture, by practice, by the accumulated weight of what they have chosen to do with the days they have been given. The capacity for virtue is natural to the species, he thought. The actual virtue is not. That must be made. A city in ancient Greece understood this in ways that modern political arrangements sometimes forget. The laws of the polis were not only instruments of order or mechanisms for resolving disputes, they were, in Aristotle's understanding, instruments of habituation. They were designed, or ought to be designed, to guide citizens through the repeated performance of just and temperate and courageous actions until those actions became second nature to the citizenry as a whole. The good city was the city that formed good people. The inquiry into what constitutes a good individual life opened, almost inevitably, onto the inquiry into what kind of community makes that life possible, and the text that Aristotle wrote on ethics led directly into the text he wrote on politics, because he saw no clean boundary between them. The individual and the community were not separate problems. They were the same problem approached from two different angles. This is why the Nicomachean Ethics does not end with a portrait of the virtuous individual standing alone in their excellence. It ends with a turn toward legislation. It ends with the recognition that human beings are, as Aristotle put it, political animals, not in the modern sense of creatures who engage in partisan maneuvering, but in the older and more fundamental sense of creatures who can only become fully themselves inside a community that provides the conditions for their becoming. The lone human being, outside all community, is either a beast or a god. The ordinary human being, the one Aristotle was interested in, is neither. They are the creature who needs others in order to find out what they are capable of being. The walkways of the Lyceum grew quiet in the late afternoons. Students dispersed. The conversations that had moved through those covered colonnades for hours about courage, about justice, about whether a person who acts rightly but feels reluctantly is truly virtuous or only performing virtue. Those conversations settled into the stone and the cooling air, and the man who had guided them returned to his notes, or walked a little further on his own, or stood still for a moment in the particular light of an Athenian evening that falls in long oblique lines across everything it touches. Those arguments did not stop there. They moved the way arguments do, not through the air but through writing, through the attention of people who encountered them and found that they had something to say to the life being lived in front of them. They moved through centuries that Aristotle could not have known about, through languages he never spoke, into rooms he would not have recognized, landing finally in the hands of people who found in those old working notes something that still felt, across all that distance, like a fair description of what they were seeing when they looked honestly at the shape of a human life. In 1981, a philosopher named Alasdair MacIntyre sat with those texts and with a long history of what had come after them, and he wrote a book that argued something unusual and to many of his contemporaries unsettling. He argued that modern moral philosophy had made itself incoherent, not by accident and not through laziness, but through a specific historical loss. The vocabulary of ethics, words like virtue, duty, rights, good, was still in circulation, still being used in moral arguments of all kinds. But the framework that had originally given those words their meaning had been quietly abandoned, and the words had been left to float in a kind of semantic homelessness, available to be picked up and used, but no longer anchored to the account of human nature and human purpose that had made them make sense. MacIntyre's argument was that the vocabulary of virtue, in particular, could not be understood outside the teleological framework from which it had come. To say that courage is a virtue, in Aristotle's account, is to say that courage is what a human being needs in order to function excellently as the kind of creature a human being is, to fulfill the characteristic activity of a rational social animal who lives inside a community and faces the genuine dangers that such a life involves. That claim depends on there being a meaningful account of what a human being is for. When that account was removed from modern philosophy through a long set of historical and intellectual developments that MacIntyre traced with considerable care, the word virtue remained, but its justification did not. What was left looked less like ethics than like a set of preferences dressed in older and more authoritative clothing. He returned to Aristotle not as a historian returning to a museum, but as a philosopher returning to a living resource. The texts were old, the problems they addressed were not. The question of how a human being becomes excellent and what community is required to make that possible, and how the virtues relate to each other inside a coherent character, and what practical wisdom looks like when it is actually functioning. These were not questions that had been answered since Aristotle had asked them. They had been set aside, or replaced with different questions, or buried under frameworks that MacIntyre found less adequate to the actual texture of moral life. He returned, and what he found there was still usable, still precise. Still, in certain important ways, right about what it was describing. There is something quietly steadying about that image, the image of a philosopher in the 20th century, finding that a set of arguments made in Athens in the 4th century BCE still has something exact to say about the difficulties of living well in a world that Aristotle could not have imagined. It suggests that those difficulties are, at some level, the same difficulties, that the human being navigating the question of how to be courageous without being reckless, how to be generous without being prodigal, how to respond to a genuine wrong with a feeling that is neither cold indifference nor corrosive rage, that human being is doing something that has not changed as much as the centuries between Aristotle and the present might suggest. Martha Nussbaum came to Aristotle's texts from a different direction and found different possibilities inside them. She took the function argument, the claim that the good human life consists in the active exercise of distinctively human capacities, and she asked what it would look like to apply that insight to all human beings, rather than to the particular subset of human beings whose flourishing Aristotle himself had been primarily interested in. She was interested in what she came to call the capabilities approach, a framework for thinking about social justice and human development that asked not what resources people have, but what they are actually capable of doing and being, what forms of human activity and experience their circumstances make genuinely available to them. The question she was asking was Aristotelian at its root, not what does this person have, but what is this person able to do, to exercise, to live out in the actual shape of their days. She extended that question across lines that Aristotle's own account had not crossed, across gender, across class, across the wide differences of circumstance and culture that determine whether the capacities a human being possesses can actually be expressed in the life they are living. She took what was most durable in his framework, the insistence that a human life should be evaluated not by external indicators alone, but by the quality of activity it makes possible, and she brought it to bear on questions of global justice that Aristotle had not asked, blight, and in some cases would not have thought to ask. The argument moved, as arguments do, into territory its originator did not foresee. What remained recognizably his was the underlying commitment. that a human being is not primarily a container to be filled with goods or a calculator of preferences to be satisfied, but a creature with a characteristic form of life, and that a just community is one that makes it possible for that form of life to be genuinely, actively lived. There is a parallel that arrived, as parallels sometimes do, from an entirely unexpected direction. In China, roughly contemporaneous with Aristotle, the centuries overlapping in the way that distant lives sometimes do when measured against the longer scale of history, a tradition of ethical thought was developing that would eventually be associated with Confucius and with texts that carried ideas into the culture with a persistence and depth not unlike the persistence of Aristotle's own writings in the West. In that tradition, there is a concept whose name translates roughly as centrality or commonality. Zhongyong, the way of the mean, the doctrine that the excellent person is the one who finds, in each situation, the response that is neither too much nor too little, neither the excess that overshoots what a moment requires, nor the deficiency that fails to rise to it. The concept appears independently of anything that was happening in Athens. The intuition behind it was not borrowed from Aristotle, and the tradition that carried it was shaped by assumptions about human nature and society that differ significantly from his. And yet the structural similarity is there. The sense that virtue is a kind of precision, that the excellent response to a situation is neither the extreme to one side, nor the extreme to the other, but the response that is exactly adequate to what the situation is, what the person acting is, and what the occasion genuinely calls for. When the same intuition arrives in two different places, through entirely different cultural and intellectual paths, without any line of influence connecting them, the similarity is worth noticing, not because it proves anything conclusively about the nature of morality or the universality of ethical principles, but because it suggests that the insight underlying the golden mean, that excellence is a kind of attentiveness, a learned ability to perceive what a situation requires and respond to it with precisely that, may be reflecting something real about the difficulty of human life and the character that navigates it well. Two traditions, two different accounts of what human beings are and what their communities are for, arriving separately at the same basic description of what it looks like when a person gets the response right. The image of a student in ancient Athens and a student in ancient China, both being guided towards something like the middle way, both being told that the virtuous response is neither too much nor too little, but exactly what this moment needs. That image has a kind of quiet symmetry to it, like water finding its level through different stone, but settling, eventually, at the same depth. The Lyceum's walkways are gone now, or rather what remains of them is not walkways but archaeological description, careful historical reconstruction, the image scholars have assembled from sources that are themselves partial and uncertain. The institution that Aristotle founded in 335 BCE, and that became for many years a center of inquiry into almost everything that could be inquired into, it did not survive the centuries intact. The texts that emerged from it survived better than the buildings, though not without their own losses and fragmentations, and centuries of miscopying and recovery and reinterpretation. What arrived into the medieval world, and then into the Renaissance, and then into modernity, was something partial, something whose gaps had been filled, and whose emphases had shifted through each passage from one cultural context to another. And still the arguments inside those texts held something recognizable. Still the account of courage as acting from fear rather than in the absence of it. Still the portrait of the generous person who gives the right amount to the right people at the right time and takes pleasure in the giving. Still, the description of practical wisdom is something that cannot be reduced to a formula, that requires the long cultivation of perceptual attentiveness that no set of rules can replace. Still, all of that felt, to the readers who encountered it, like a description of something they had actually seen in the world, or in themselves, or in the people they most respected. That is a strange kind of durability, not the durability of an answer that has been accepted and filed away, the durability of a question that remains genuinely open, and an approach to that question that remains across all its limitations and the long historical distance it has traveled, one of the more honest and careful approaches that has been tried. Aristotle himself was not always easy to be honest about. The same texts that contain the portrait of magnanimity and the doctrine of the mean also contain claims about natural slavery, about the incapacity of women for full rational life, about who is and is not eligible for the kind of flourishing his ethics describes. Those exclusions are real, and they are not peripheral. They are embedded in the structure of his social and political thought in ways that cannot simply be extracted without affecting the rest. The capabilities approach that Nussbaum built from his foundations is partly an attempt to take what was most defensible in his framework and rebuild it without those exclusions, to honor what the function argument gets right about human beings, while refusing to limit its application to the particular subset of human beings whose capacities Aristotle's own world allowed him to see clearly. The tradition does not move forward cleanly. It moves the way most traditions move, through argument and revision and partial recovery and creative extension, and sometimes through the simple recognition that a framework which illuminated so much was also, in specific ways, blind. Holding both of those things at once, the illumination and the blindness, is part of what it means to take a tradition seriously, rather than either dismissing it or receiving it without examination. What remains, held carefully and with both eyes open, is still considerable. The account of character as something built through practice, slowly, over the whole course of a life, the insistence that virtue is not merely knowing the right thing, but being the kind of person from whom the right response arises naturally, because it has been cultivated over years into a second nature that no longer needs to be consciously applied. The claim that practical wisdom, the cultivated ability to perceive what a specific situation morally requires, is not a rule or a formula, but a form of perception, the way an experienced physician sees a patient's condition before articulating it, the way a craftsman's hand knows the right pressure before the mind has finished calculating. These things hold. They hold not because they have gone unchallenged, but because they keep being returned to, kept being found adequate to what people actually see when they watch human beings navigating the difficulty of living well together in shared communities. They hold because the alternative, the view that virtue is simply compliance with a rule, that character is simply preference, that moral life is simply the application of a principle to a case, keeps being found incomplete, keeps leaving something out that the older and more patient account includes. Somewhere in the present, in an ordinary life that Aristotle knew nothing about, and that carries none of the markers of the world he was describing, something is happening that he would nonetheless have recognized. A person is in a situation that requires a response, not a dramatic situation, not a crisis that announces itself as morally significant. An ordinary moment, a conversation, a decision about how much to say and how much to hold back, a recognition that someone near them has been wronged and that something is being called for, a feeling of anger rising that needs to be neither suppressed entirely nor released without calibration. The person pauses. They are not calculating. They have been in situations like this before, and before that, and before that, and what the repetition has built in them is not a rule, but a kind of attentiveness, a capacity to feel, in the particular texture of this particular moment, what it is actually asking for. They respond, not perfectly, perhaps. Virtue is never quite complete, never quite beyond the possibility of further refinement, but with the kind of measured, honest, appropriately calibrated attention that is the best a person can bring to a situation that is always to some extent new. That response, that small, quiet, adequately calibrated response to an ordinary moment, is what Aristotle spent the Nicomachean Ethics describing. Not the dramatic gesture, not the conspicuous act of heroism or generosity that everyone notices. The ordinary response, performed by someone who has spent years becoming the kind of person from whom it arises naturally. The action that is exactly what the moment requires, neither more nor less. The arrow reaching exactly where it needed to go, not because someone calculated the midpoint between too far left and too far right, but because a long practice had built into the archer the feel of the right release. Character is this, the accumulated weight of what a person has practiced, settled into the body and the habits of attention until it runs in them, the way water runs in familiar channels, without effort, without resistance, with the particular ease of something that has been true for long enough to feel inevitable, though it was never inevitable, though it was made out of the ordinary material of choice and repetition and the patient return to practice after failure. The long work of becoming is never finished. Aristotle knew this. He was not describing a destination, but a direction, not the moment of arrival, but the quality of sustained motion toward what a human being is capable of being. The person of good character is not the person who has completed the work of virtue and can now rest. They are the person who has built, through the long effort of practice and return and practice again, the stable disposition from which excellent action continues to arise, not as a conscious achievement, but as the natural expression of who they have become. The child in the marketplace did not yet know what she was beginning. She knew only the discomfort of returning what she had taken, the resistance in her body, the wish to be elsewhere. She did not know that this moment, and all the moments like it that would follow, were the material from which something would eventually be built, something that would come to feel, years later, like simply herself, though it had been made, one small action at a time, out of everything she had been asked to do before she understood why. The Lyceum stands now only in what came from it, in the arguments that moved through those covered walkways, and then through centuries, and through languages that Aristotle's students could not have imagined, landing finally in the hands of people who found in them a description of something they were already dimly beginning to see in the world around them. The building is gone. The arguments are still in motion.